In this video, I'm going to cover one of the most challenging yet effective ways of rendering with pen and ink, the cross-contour hatching technique. I'm going to show you how this technique was used by a number of world masters and then demonstrate a few different ways it can be done. Cross-contour hatching belongs to a family of linear rendering techniques where a succession of fine, closely spaced lines are put down to create the illusion of value and form. The first and easiest technique in the hatching family is the parallel hatching technique, where lines are put down in a single angle, such as this wonderful drawing by DaVinci. The second is called cross-hatching, where layers of straight hatching are put down at varying angles, such as this drawing by Levine. And the last, most complex member of the family, and the topic of this video, is the cross-contour technique, where layers of hatching follow the forms being drawn. All hatching techniques have their origins in engraving, a printmaking process that developed concurrently in Germany and northern Italy in the 15th century, which required the printmaker to painstakingly carve lines into a copper plate. Those artists overcame the limitations of this linear medium by discovering that they could create the illusion of value by carving a series of closely spaced lines. In this print by one of the first masters of engraving, an artist known only as the master of the playing cards, we see the use of the parallel hatching technique. Cross-contour hatching developed soon after, with masters such as the Alsatian printmaker and painter Martin Schongauer developing a sophisticated rendering method that was both bold, expressive, and sensitive. A young admirer and collector of Schongauer's tried visiting him, but learned that he had died some years prior. His name was Albrecht Durer, and he would develop the art of contour hatching to its absolute zenith. How did the hatching techniques, which developed due to the technical limitations of printmaking, make their way into drawing, which has no such limitations? I can only speculate, but drawing at the time was rarely an end in itself, but was used either for practice or for preparatory work. It's not hard to imagine that printmakers would use drawing to practice their hatching techniques, or make preparatory sketches to decide what hatch pattern to use in their engravings. And, since many artists, particularly in Northern Europe, were both printmakers and painters, it's no surprise that their preparatory work was informed by their training as engravers. Furthermore, the importance of engraving during the Renaissance in disseminating artistic ideas should not be underestimated. Public art museums did not exist, and the way many artists were exposed to the work of other artists was through engravings. Copying engravings was an important part of artistic training at the time, so it's no surprise that hatching techniques would have an influence on the way artists drew. Though engraving is a rarely practiced art today, being supplanted by far less time-consuming methods of reproduction, cross-contour hatching remains a very popular way to draw. Contour hatching not only describes light and shadow, but also reinforces the forms, giving drawings greater clarity and a stronger three-dimensional effect. Furthermore, hatched drawings have a lively rhythmic energy to them, being composed of many busy, repeating strokes. It's a fun, challenging way to draw, useful not just for users of pen and ink, but of any dry drawing media. Okay, let's look at some breathtaking examples of cross-contour hatching and examine the way it was used by artists of the past. Of course, one cannot speak of cross-contour hatching without speaking of Albrecht Durer. In these studies of pillows, done when he was still a teenager, the precision and lightness with which his strokes describe the twists and turns of stretched and crumpled cloth is remarkable. There is a tremendous conservation of strokes, and the layering of hatching is kept to a minimum, each stroke adding information. The dexterity required to do this kind of work is almost superhuman, and to my mind, no other artist came close to Durer's achievements in cross-contour hatching. Here are a few more examples of Durer's pen and ink work. Even in these relatively quick sketches, it feels like no stroke is out of place, and every line makes a crucial contribution to the final effect. Note that he even changes his technique slightly when rendering different surfaces. In the cloth, the strokes are slightly longer and straighter. In the body, the strokes become slightly shorter and more rounded, and in the wooden planks and grass, they become heavier and even straighter. Durer's subtle and dexterous contour hatching very carefully describes the form, and the layering is kept to a minimum, giving the drawings clarity and lightness. You rarely see more than 3 overlapping layers of hatching in his work, even in his early efforts where he's still developing his abilities. Despite the lack of gradual layering, he's able to achieve delicate value transitions and get bold contrast. And while his line variation is limited, he does manage to introduce a large variety of strokes into his drawing. We have patches of long, sinuous curving strokes that seamlessly flow into each other. There are short curly strokes that describe small surface detail, and occasionally we have what I call spiderweb strokes, a leftover from the Gothic era that don't really make sense in terms of describing the form. I think of these as calligraphic flourishes that add sprightly movement to the drawing. Here's another far less known artist whose work I greatly admire, the Dutch painter and engraver Jacob de Gheyn. His curly, slightly frenetic hatching, combined with his slightly humorous subject matter, makes his drawing incredibly warm and compelling. Though lacking in Durer's superhuman precision, he makes up for it with a more expressive textural effects through the use of thick and thin lines. Gheyn's hatching is more calligraphic and playful than Durer's, seemingly composed of short, flourish-like curves. Like Durer and most artists who are trained engravers, there is a conservation of strokes, and it's hard to find more than 4 overlapping layers. In one of my favorite works, The Small Drawing of a Frog, we see Gheyn's remarkable ability to sensitively record the turning of form and the transition of light and shadow, while being incredibly energetic with the rhythmic patterns of cross-hatching dancing across this little frog, making it feel like it's about to wake up and hop off the paper. Another one of my favorite pen and ink draftsmen is the Italian Baroque painter Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, better known as Guercino, another artist with a gentle wit and an effortlessly precise touch. His drawings never feel belabored or heavy, which I think is the ultimate praise. Art, no matter how difficult, should never feel like work, and there is something dance-like in Guercino's touch that makes his work tremendously appealing. Guercino's technique is actually a cross, pun intended, between the parallel hatching technique and the contour cross-hatching technique. Most of the hatching is done in a limited range of angles. I suspect that he was hatching with what I call the elbow stroke, where the elbow is planted on a table and used as a rotation point to put down fast strokes. I think that's responsible for the very light and spontaneous nature of Guercino's drawings. The use of additional textures, such as stipples and contrasting thick accents, also add charm and variety to his work. This method really cannot be belabored due to the limited number of angles you can put down, so it's best for quick work where contrast and finish is not the priority. And of course, there's the king of the light yet precise touch, the consummate Peter Paul Rubens. Surprisingly, we have very little pen and ink work by him, but what exists demonstrates a complete mastery of the medium. There's not as much conservation of strokes as in the work of Durer of Gheyn, and Rubens lays down many layers of curved hatching to build up his values. But the busyness of the hatching never gets messy and contributes to making these drawings incredibly energetic. And lastly, another artist with incredible skill in the cross-contour hatching technique is, of course, Michelangelo. One of the things that make this method so difficult is that you have to have a solid understanding of the form in order to wrap your hatching around it. While Michelangelo's hatching is not as calligraphically precise as that of Durer or Rubens, his training as a sculptor gave him a three-dimensional understanding of the form, allowing him to imbue his drawings with an unparalleled sense of structure and weight. Here's some valuable advice I was given early in my studies that I'm going to pass on to all of you. If you want to draw the figure well, take figure sculpture classes. Sculpting the human form leads to a better understanding of it, and a better understanding leads to better drawing. One of the difficulties people have is that the hatching needs to curve in order to faithfully follow the form, and creating those curving lines takes practice. A great exercise is to fill a few pages with waves of hatching of different wavelengths. Try to keep the spacing between the hatching consistent throughout, and try to connect your blocks of hatching so that one curve flows uninterrupted into the next. I would also practice applying different degrees of pressure. After a few pages, you'll get comfortable creating curved hatching in every direction. You can, of course, rotate your paper to make hatching at certain angles more comfortable, but I would also practice drawing different angles without rotating your paper, since there will be situations, for example in a figure drawing class where you're working at a drawing horse or an easel, where rotating your paper is not feasible. Before we start hatching, here are a few important rules to keep in mind. Number 1. Keep the spacing between your lines consistent. Hatching is an optical illusion that tricks the eye into seeing value where there is only line. Too wide a spacing breaks the illusion, turning what should be perceived as value into texture. Making the spacing very narrow is not as big an issue, but results in uneven, messy-looking hatching. Some instructors will suggest making hatching closer together where the forms are farther away, and wider where the forms are nearer. While the principle behind it is sound, again, you have to be careful not to make the hatching too widely spaced, lest you break the illusion. Rule number 2. Since the human body is composed of curving forms, most of your hatching should be curved. There are exceptions, which we'll talk about during the demo, but as a rule, putting down straight lines across a curving form will make those forms appear flat and should be avoided. Rule number 3. The general angles of your hatching need to be steeper on side-facing planes and shallower on top and bottom-facing planes. This effect can be demonstrated on this cube, on which I have taped 45-degree lines. Though the angles of the lines on both sides are the same, due to foreshortening, the angles will look steeper on the side-facing planes. And if I rotate the cube up and down, you'll see the angle on top and bottom-facing planes flattening out. Let's see what this principle looks like on a planar head onto which I've placed strips of tape at approximately 45-degree angles. True to the rule, the angle of the tape on side-facing planes looks steeper, and on top and bottom-facing planes look flatter. Therefore, placing steeper angled hatching on side-facing planes and flatter angled hatching on top and bottom planes will make those planes look like they're receding in space. This principle applies to round objects as well. Here I have placed 45-degree lines across this plaster pair. Where the sides of the pair curve away, the curvature of the lines becomes steeper. As a result, the lines look like they're doing an S-curve across the form. Rule number 4. Avoid putting down more than 6 layers. Anything more will make your hatching look confused and messy. With transparent ink, more layers can be put down, but even then, the fewer layers you can put down, the better. Full disclosure, I quite often violate this rule because I enjoy building up strong contrast in my work and don't mind the slightly messy effect it creates. Rule number 5. Avoid right-angled hatching. When hatching is put down at a right angle, it creates little squares which create the impression of flatness. Hatching should always be put down at angles to create diamonds, which don't have a flattening effect. Of course, right-angle hatching could always be broken up with a third-angle hatch. Here's a demo of the cross-contour hatching technique on a simple form, this plastic pear. Cross-contour hatching is a difficult way to draw, and being systematic is very important to getting a successful result. Once your object is sketched in, I recommend you indicate where the object goes from light to shadow and the shape of the cast shadow. I would also indicate where you're going to place your highlights. Not every pen and ink drawing includes highlights, but if you do decide to put them in, you'll need to know where they are so you don't accidentally put hatching over them. I usually put down a layer of hatching along the core shadow. By the way, if you're not familiar with this term, I recommend you stop this video and watch my tutorial on light logic, which will explain the different kinds of shadows, their various properties, and how to use those properties to get the illusion of three-dimensional form. The initial angle you start with is not particularly important, and I will sometimes begin with a layer of vertical hatching. In this case, though, I'm going to make my initial hatch at roughly 45 degrees. This is a good place to start because it'll give you room to place more vertical hatching at the sides and more horizontal hatching on the top and bottoms of the form. Hatching along the core shadow allows me to indicate the shape of the shadow and also the relative softness of the shadow edge. Where the turn of the form is more gradual, I'll make my core shadows wider. Where the turn of the form is more abrupt, I'll make the core shadow narrower. The next step is to put down another layer of hatching to fill in the shadow area. I'll push this layer past the core shadow slightly, which will create that all-important form-turning halftone. Since the shadow side of the pear is where the forms are turning away from me, I've gone in with a more vertical angled hatch. This is a large area to cover, so I work in patches trying to get the marks to line up with each other. If you don't get perfect alignment, not to worry, because you'll go over them again with a different angled hatch to get more continuity. This leads to an important point. Don't stress that your hatching is not perfect. It'll get better with time, but once you have a few layers of hatch down, those small imperfections will not be as visible. Depending on how dark the shadows are, I might put in a second or even third layer, curving each layer in a different direction. Once I've established the shadow side, I'll turn to the lighter side of the form and start putting down halftones. I try to keep the hatching there at most to 2 layers, the second layer mostly reserved for that all-important form-turning halftone at the shadow edge. Once I've completed the hatching in the area of light, I'll return to the shadows and begin to work out the details of the forms there. My general advice is to keep the details in the shadows simple, because even if there is a lot of detail there, the diminished light will make them less noticeable. Here's the finished drawing of the pear. Drawing such simple forms is invaluable and will get you ready for more advanced subjects like the human form. And since I've drawn more than one pear in my life, let's move on and do a figure drawing demo. After sketching the figure in pencil, I will indicate the location of the light break and perhaps where I plan to leave the highlights. Once I've inked the contours, I might take a few moments just to work out my hatching strategy. Based on the light direction, I notice that the edge of the shadow is close to where the forms are facing me, so I decide that I'm going to start by putting down a hatch at a relatively shallow angle to represent the core shadow. This is followed by longer hatching at a slightly steeper angle to fill in the rest of the body shadow. When putting down the body shadow, extend your hatching slightly past the core to create that all-important form-turning halftone. Note that shadow edges will be more or less gradual depending on the forms. Softer where the forms are wider, sharper where the forms are narrower. You might also have cast shadows, which depending on the light source might be very sharp. In such cases, shade right up against the shadow edge to make the transition abrupt. Then I might put down another layer to darken the shadow and then switch over to the light. Here is where the principle of sides steeper, tops and bottoms flatter becomes very important, because it is that shift in angle that will describe the turning of the form. Where I see side-facing planes, I will generally use steeper angled hatching. Where I see top and bottom facing planes, I will use a shallower angle for my hatching. Try to make the hatching curve around the forms and connect them. This should be mostly done with a single layer of hatching. At this point, I also work along the edge of the shadow and apply more halftones to make sure the forms are turning correctly. Then it's back to the shadows, where I reinforce the anatomical details and add additional contrast to the darkest darks. Here's the finished drawing. Doing a drawing demo after showing examples by Durer, Rubens, and Michelangelo is ill-advised, of course, but I hope that my humble efforts inspire all of you to try this difficult yet rewarding way of drawing. For those of you interested in what I'm drawing with, I'm using a pretty little fountain pen from the 1940s, a Wahl Eversharp Skyline, filled with Rohrer and Klingner Sepia ink. Thanks for watching, stay tuned for more drawing instruction, and of course, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to reply.